This video is going to be on cylinder leakage testing. Now the purpose of a cylinder leakage test is to determine exactly where we're losing compression in the cylinder. So in the compression testing video that I did, we made a hypothetical situation where number 3 was just under the specification for being normal. It was at 99 psi, it has to be a minimum of 100 psi. And so we want to figure out where that compression is going. We have already done a wet compression test on it, and depending on what we find with the wet compression test, that may be sufficient. But if the compression does not come up with a wet compression test, then we need to move forward with a cylinder leakage test. So what the cylinder leakage test does is you're going to bring the piston up to top dead center compression stroke, and you're going to pressurize the cylinder with air. And we're going to do that with a hose very similar to the compression testing hose that we used. And we're going to use a set of gauges right here that will show us how much leakage we have on the cylinder. So that's what we're going to do as far as the cylinder leakage test goes. And so the first thing we need to do is bring the engine up to top dead center compression stroke. The easiest way to do that, it would be to install your hose for your leakage tester, and just put your finger over the end of the hose and then crank the engine, and you'll feel it puff of air when the cylinder reaches top dead center. Okay, I'll do it one more time so that you can kind of see it. So it just puffed air. So the piston has come up to top dead center and then it's gone just past top dead center. So now what we need to do is we need to bring the piston exactly up to top dead center. I'm going to use the crankshaft to rotate the engine around to top dead center. And I'm going to use a really long 1/2-inch drive ratchet and an extension and a 15mm socket, because that's the size of the crankshaft pulley bolt on this engine. The reason I want to use a long wrench is because sometimes turning the engine can be a little difficult. You want to use some leverage so that it makes it a lot easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the socket right here on the wrench, and I'm going to turn it around in the same direction that the engine turns in. So pay attention as to what direction the engine spins, and you want to turn the crankshaft in the same direction. I've also installed my top dead center indicator, which is a little plastic rod that I showed you in the other video. And I've installed that in the cylinder. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate it around. See how that rod's coming up? I want to rotate it around until that rod just starts to change directions. So it's still coming up, still coming up. Sometimes you got to make sure it doesn't get stuck. That's why you want to use a plastic rod or a pencil. If you use a screwdriver, you can get jammed in there and you can actually damage the piston. So you want to use something that's nice and soft. So it's still coming up. Okay, you see there, it just started to change direction. So I'm going to bring it back up to the top, right there. So now we're at top dead center compression stroke. And so what I'll do is I'll leave this the ratchet and the wrench handy, because when you pressurize it with air, sometimes the air pressure will push the cylinder down and you'll get a false reading. So you want to make sure that the crankshaft doesn't move. So the next step would be to remove our top dead center indicator and reinstall our hose for the leakage tester. Now the difference between the hose on the leakage tester and the hose on the compression tester is the compression testing hose has a Schrader valve in it right here. The leakage tester hose does not. So I've got my hose connected. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to calibrate my gauges, my cylinder leakage test gauges. And the way you calibrate those is, remember, for a cylinder leakage test, what we're doing is we're putting air in the cylinder. And so what we want to do is we want to pressurize these things with air. So we hook up an air hose to it, And if you notice on my gauges, they're looks like it's reading about 140 psi. What I want to do is I want to calibrate these things so they read 0. So I'm going to rotate, and the way you calibrate it is this little knob on the bottom. You pull out on the, see how this snaps together, and you pull out like this, and then you can twist it. And so I'm going to bring it right around to 0, just like that, and then snap my lid back on. So now you can't turn it. And now it's calibrated, it's ready to test. So what I want to do before I hook up my gauge to it, so I'm going to hook this hose in here, but before I do that, what I want to do is I want to make sure that my engine doesn't spin. So this is where it's handy to have a lab partner or a buddy help you out, where you can put your wrench back on the engine and then hook up the air to it. Since I don't have anybody with me, I'm going to go ahead and hook up the air, and we'll see if, what I'm going to do is I'm going to watch the belt and make sure the belt doesn't turn. If the belt doesn't turn, then I know the engine didn't move and we've got a good reading. So I'm going to go ahead and pull back on the collar, hook up the air. The belt did not move. And so at top dead center, we have about 10 psi that's leaking. Actually, not even 10 psi. So we have less than 0, or well, it's about 10 or 5 or so percent. 5, let's see, 5, 10, 15, 20. So it's just over 5% leakage. Now, a lot of times there's not a specification on how much cylinder leakage you should have, but anything less than 10% is great. And so we got just a little over 5% leakage. This cylinder is fine. So the reason for our low compression is, the reason this cylinder is fine is because when we tested it, it had 179 psi. But if it did have a problem, then what we would do is we would listen for air escaping. So if the air is, if we had like 30% leakage, what we could do is we could take off the oil filler cap right here and listen. And if we could hear air inside the oil filler cap, that means the air is coming up through the valves. And so we have some bad valves. The other place that we could look is we could take a look at the tailpipe. So if we look down here at the tailpipe, and if we hear air coming out of the tailpipe, that's the exhaust valve. If we hear air in the intake, that's the intake valve. If we hear air in the crankcase, then that would be cylinder rings. So if we took the oil dipstick out and we hear air coming out of here, that would be compression rings. So if we hear air in the crankcase, that's compression rings. If we hear air in the intake, that's the intake valve. If we hear air in the exhaust, that's an exhaust valve. And so those are pretty much the places where you lose compression. And so that's the reason for a cylinder leakage test. One of the things with a cylinder leakage test is you do not have to remove all of the spark plugs. You can remove just the one spark plug on the bad cylinder. But we have all the spark plugs out because we were just doing a compression test, and you do have to remove all the spark plugs for a compression test. So that wraps up cylinder leakage testing.